Chapter 2, Early Days. President George Washington appointed the most Supreme Court justices, 11. The first U.S. government set up the federal court system. This engraving shows the first president, George Washington, far right, with his advisors in 1789. So how does the Supreme Court work? The Constitution created the judicial branch of the U.S. government, but it did not explain how the court system would operate. It also didn't say how many justices the Supreme Court should have. It left the details up to the legislative branch or the U.S. Congress. Organizing the lower courts. In 1789, Congress chose a group of men to set up the federal court system. A Connecticut congressman named Oliver Ellsworth led the group. He wrote the Judiciary Act of 1789. This declared that the Supreme Court would have one Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. The Judiciary Act also set up the lower courts. It grouped the nation's courts into areas called circuits. Supreme Court judges traveled along regular routes to hear cases in the circuit courts alongside local judges. It was known as riding circuit. This map shows the federal court circuits in 1790. Eastern Circuit, Middle Circuit, Southern Circuit. U.S. Chief Justices: John Jay, 1789 to 1795, John Rutledge, 1795, William Cushing, 1796. He was appointed as chief but did not serve. Oliver Ellsworth, 1796 to 1800, John Marshall, 1801 to 1835, Roger B. Taney, 1836 to 1864, Salmon P. Chase, 1864 to 1873, Morrison Waite, 1874 to 1888, Melville Fuller, from 1888 to 1910, Edward D. White, 1910 to 1921, William H. Taft, 1921 to 1930, Charles E. Hughes, 1930 to 1941, Harlan F. Stone, 1941 to 1946, Fred M. Vinson, 1946 to 1953, Earl Warren, 1953 to 1969, Warren E. Burger, 1969 to 1986, William Rehnquist, 1986 to 2005, John Roberts, 2005 to present. The Supreme Court meets. The Supreme Court met for the first time in New York City in 1790. President George Washington chose a lawyer named John Jay to be Chief Justice. Jay had helped to write the Constitution. The first meeting of the Supreme Court did not go as planned. Only 3 associate judges showed up. The others were too busy or didn't want to make the long trip. There wasn't much for the justices to do anyway. It took most of the first year to organize the new court system. Judges also spent time riding circuit 2 times a year. They didn't actually hear any cases until the Supreme Court moved the next year to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Federal appeals courts are still organized into regions called circuits. Today, the United States has 13 circuits. Stagecoach justice. Supreme Court justices had to travel from city to city. They spent up to 19 hours a day in bumpy stagecoaches. Roads were often rocky or muddy. The justices complained bitterly about the exhausting travel. Chief Justice John Jay even threatened to quit. In 1793, Congress agreed that justices had to travel to each circuit only once a year instead of twice. No one rides circuits today. Until smaller courts were established, Supreme Court justices traveled around the country to hear cases. No advice here. The first Supreme Court set limits on its duties. The justices wanted to keep their powers separate from the other branches of government. They even refused President Washington when he asked for advice. People were so upset by Jay's treaty that they burned likenesses of John Jay. But when Washington asked Chief Justice John Jay to help fix America's poor relationship with the British, Jay agreed. He traveled to Great Britain in 1794 and worked out an agreement called Jay's Treaty. The treaty settled many problems and established peaceful trade policy. Unfortunately, it angered many at home who opposed any agreements with the British. Jay left the Supreme Court the next year to become governor of New York. Rejected. The Constitution gives the president the power to choose Supreme Court justices, but the Senate must vote to approve all justices before they formally take their positions. Supreme Court justices usually serve for life or until they retire. In 1795, Washington chose Associate Justice John Rutledge to replace John Jay as Chief Justice. Rutledge complained in public about Jay's treaty. He said he would rather see President Washington die than agree to sign the treaty. Rutledge's statement shocked many Americans. The Senate rejected Rutledge as Chief Justice. John Rutledge served as Chief Justice for several months before being rejected by the Senate.